Hello everybody, how you doing? I hope your studies are going smoothly. Welcome back, and welcome to this video on AQA A-level Psychology Paper 2 2024. Before we crack on, this is how it's going to work. There's no insider information, this isn't a leaks video or anything like that. I'm going to talk through what's come up each year, we're going to talk about the structure of the papers, I'm going to give you my thoughts, my advice as an experienced teacher, and that will lead us to some conclusions about things that we might use to help us to prepare for paper 2 this year. Yeah? Take it with a pinch of salt. The reason that I'm doing it in slightly longer form and showing you what hasn't come up is so that you can see where I'm coming from. Yeah? And you can draw your own conclusions from that as well. Okay? But do revise everything. Alright, with that said, let's crack on. So, approaches. Last year we had a bit of psychodynamic, a bit of cognitive, a fair bit of SLT, social learning theory, a little bit of bio, and then an 8 marker on cognitive neuroscience, which did throw some people, I think. Before that, psychodynamic, social learning theory, and humanistic. So that's psychodynamic and social learning theory twice already. Before that, a few on behaviourism, biological approach, and then a short essay comparing humanistic and psychodynamic. So there you go, look, psychodynamic has come up 3 times in a row already. Then humanistic, psychodynamic and behaviourism, that was the 16 marker that year. 2019 was a little bit of bio, a little bit of behaviourist, a little bit of psychodynamic, a fair bit of SLT, a bit of RM, and then an 8 marker on origins. Before that, cognitive, psychodynamic, and then a 16 marker on behaviourist. And before that, biological, psychodynamic, and humanistic. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, looking at the structure of this over the years, you can see that we've had a few 16 markers, but not a 16 marker in the last 3 assessment periods. So what does that mean? Well, again, only AQA know, but possibly you might conclude from that maybe there'll be a 16 marker on approaches this time. It seems possible, doesn't it? Looking at that history. What else? Well, they don't seem to put RM on approaches. Now that might mean that they won't bother this year. They haven't done for the last 4 years. But it might mean that, they look at that and they go, oh, well, maybe we will drip some of that into approaches this year. If they're going to put a 16 marker on there, maybe not. But it's a possibility, isn't it? In terms of actual content then, topics. Origins of psychology and Wilhelm Wundt and his role. Hasn't really come up very much at all, has it? We've got that 8 marker in 2019. Outside of that, that seems like an obvious gap. The cognitive approach, for me, in my opinion, is another obvious gap. I'm feeling like, that could be a substantial source of marks. It could be an essay. But given that last year they had cognitive neuroscience, maybe they won't have that as the focus. Maybe it'll just be a smaller question. But it's never come up as an essay. It's not really come up very much at all in the grand scheme of things. So I do feel like that's a possible focus area. I've put a few other little ideas on there as well. It's quite difficult to really pick this apart because it's obviously a really small topic, so most of it does end up coming up in some form. But behaviourism. We've had a couple of essays in the past, but not much of it really recently, yeah? Nothing on the last couple of years, so maybe something there. Biological. We had a 4 marker last year. We had a 4 marker in 21. But never been an essay, so maybe something small in there. Maybe an evaluation question. Maybe an essay. Maybe compare it with something else. Yeah. What about if it was a 16 marker? Discuss the cognitive approach. You must refer or compare to the biological approach. Something like that. Maybe. Humanistic and maybe psychodynamic. I've kind of put them there because if you look at what has come up over the years, especially the psychodynamic approach, it seems to come up pretty much every year. Yeah, you might look at that and go, well, it came up in the last 2 years, so they won't put it up this year. Yeah, last 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. That's actually come up every year, hasn't it? So it seems logical to conclude from that they like to have something on that every year. Okay. Okay, biopsychology. And just while we're doing this, AQA know that people look at past papers and try to second guess them and predict what's going to happen. And, I'm not saying they're deliberately going to try and trip anybody up and go completely the opposite direction. But, you know, they might well decide they don't want to be particularly predictable. So, you know, as I said, do revise everything. Right, let's have a little look at this then. So, a little bit on rhythms last year, a bit of fight or flight, essay on plasticity and recovery. We've got neurons, we've got scanning, we've got the nervous system, we've got an essay on localization in 2022. 2021, bit of neurons, bit of localization, and then a scanning essay. Bit of localization, rhythms, RM, synaptic transmission, scanning, split brain was an 8 marker in 2020. In 2019, a little scanning question, bit on neurons, bit on the endocrine system, an essay on localization and lateralization. 2018, bit of RM sneaking in there, a little bit of nervous system, bit of neurons, bit of synapse, bit of endocrine system, and an 8 marker on rhythms. 2017, a bit of RM sneaking in again, 8 marker on scanning, plasticity, localization, and synaptic transmission. Where does this leave us? Okay, likely RM, look at that history. Started off, 3 out of the first 4 years had research methods, nothing the last 3 years. Maybe some will sneak in this year. In terms of topics, content. Rhythms feels like a bit of a gap for me. We had the 8 marker in 2018. We had a 2 marker on EPs and EZs last year. But outside of that, there's not really an awful lot going on. So that could be a focus, yeah? Will there be a 16 marker? Who knows, is the short answer. But look at the history, look at some balance. We said possibly in approaches, because it hasn't happened really very much recently. We've got a 16 marker in biopsychology the last 3 years running. Does that mean they like to do that nowadays? Maybe. Does it mean that they've done it so much recently they're going to switch it over this year? Maybe. But rhythms, possible focus area. Split brain research as well. Hasn't come up recently. We had an 8 marker, obviously a few years back, but because it hasn't come up recently, that could be a focus area. And then some little things that seem to come up very regularly, but possibly haven't in the last year or two. A little bit on maybe synaptic transmission. The endocrine system, maybe. I mean, we had the fight or flight last year, but there could be something little on the system itself as opposed to the stress response. And then scanning and localization haven't been a big deal. Well, they weren't there last year. They weren't a big deal in terms of scanning in the year before, but we did have that 16 marker on localization in 2022. It does come up quite regularly though, looking at the history, but it didn't come up last year, localization. So something small this year? Maybe. Right, let's have a look at research methods. Okay, this is a different beast altogether. So how I'm going to do this, I'm going to split it up a little bit differently this time. I'm going to mention the designer study questions, and I'm going to talk about what hasn't really come up much recently and what seems to come up all the time, and see what we can draw from those points, okay? Because if I take the whole spec and we take every different point and look at when it's come up, and you know it comes up in paper 1 and paper 3 as well, we will be here for a long time, okay? And I'm sure a lot of people skip over me talking through these bits anyway, so let's just not bother doing it that way. Designer study. This is your kind of, 9 marker, 12 marker. They give you a bit of a story. You have to plan basically an experiment or an observation or something like that. They give you the bullet points. It might be, talk about an ethical thing. What data would you collect? What design would you use? All of that, yeah. It's come up fairly regularly, but it has come up the last 2 years. So it could come up, but it feels based on that, maybe not. Okay, so things that haven't come up very much recently. Types of experiments, so that's like your natural, your quasi, your lab, all that sort of thing. Self-report, so that's interviews and questionnaires. Case studies, pilot studies, very small bit, some people forget about that bit, yeah, but that little test run that you do before, and kind of, what changes you'd make after a pilot study, that sort of thing. Variables, yeah, IVs, DVs, extraneous, confounding, all that sort of stuff, and how you control it. Normal distribution, so what it looks like, positive, negative skew, and p-values. Common focus areas, things that seem to come up a lot, and therefore, it would be silly to count them out even if they have come up in the last couple of years. Remember that this could be on paper 1 or paper 3 as well. So, hypotheses, so that could be like writing. Remember you've got directional, non-directional, correlational, experimental, all these different types, yeah? Remember in there, the reasons for picking a directional hypothesis, so if there's previous research. Sampling, so that's like stratified, random, volunteer, all of that stuff. Designs of experiments, so that's your independent groups. repeated measures, match pairs. Validity. Now that might be, internal, external, in terms of population, temporal validity, all of that sort of stuff. But it could also be about how you improve validity, or about how you assess validity, so thinking about things like face validity and concurrent validity. Data and averages, there'll be some maths. And stats testing, very common. Up to 7 marks, yeah? Selecting a stats test and explaining the reasons. So please go over that. Learn your table. If you've got a strategy, a mnemonic for remembering which test goes in which bit of the table, so you know the conditions, do go over that, yeah? Jot it down as soon as you get in the exam, if you need to. Okay, little summary. Going to leave that up for a sec. If you've skipped through to this point, key messages, revise everything. This isn't a leaks video or anything like that. Yeah, take it with a pinch of salt. I've gone through what has come up over the years, and that's led us to certain conclusions. Yeah, but only AQA know what AQA are going to do. Okay, what else do we need to think about? Well, reflection on last year. So when students have sat this last year, my own kind of thoughts on how it went. Social learning theory wasn't very well evaluated. Applying the approaches wasn't particularly well done, so the scenario questions. Some people struggled with linking to the question, especially when evaluating. This is very common. Every year we get students trying to evaluate theories by evaluating studies, so doing methodological criticisms, but it doesn't really get much credit unless you link that back to the question, okay? So make it clear what you're talking about. Don't go off on a tangent. Data analysis, significance and stats testing. So fairly common issues. There's nothing really special about last year in there. And the social learning theory issue hopefully will be a bit of a non-issue for this year because it's come up so much recently. Maybe it won't come up this year, but who knows. Okay, the other comment on paper 2 generally is that it is mostly application. Yeah, so straight from the AQA website, you'll see the breakdown of the when the different skills are tested or the proportion that's tested. And you will see that paper 2 is very AO2 heavy. Okay, so do expect scenario questions, but that also is there because of the research methods, and there's a lot of application in there. Okay, so look out for little bits in the question, things like, in the context of this study. Yeah, easy marks lost otherwise. Okay, final points. I've shared a few kind of tips and thoughts as I've gone through this video, but again, for, I don't know, like the 5th time now, only AQA know what AQA are going to do, yeah? There's not any kind of insider information here. I've taken the papers and I've talked about my own thoughts on what has and hasn't come up. Make sure you've looked at everything, yeah? And it's your exam, yeah? You know what you're good and what you're not good at. So don't just listen to this and go, oh yeah, I just need to do that. That's not going to solve all your problems. Reflect on how you've done. Ask your teacher for advice as well, yeah? Okay, take a calculator and remember your stats test reasons. I mentioned that a minute ago. 30 minutes per section, but 1 hour for research methods. You should know this by now, but make sure that you spend the time where it's needed. Try and break it up sensibly. Keep an eye on the clock. Underline the command words. Very common source of losing marks, yeah? If it says outline, you just do that. If it just says evaluate, don't bother by describing everything. Just launch straight into strengths and limitations. If it says compare instead of evaluate in an essay, do that. Similarities and differences. Don't be writing about strengths and limitations. In terms of essays, relevant quality evaluation is what's going to make the difference. Not writing 5, 6, 7, 8 weaker points, yeah? Absolute minimum kind of peel or point, explain, conclude structure, but you want to imagine someone sat next to you the whole time going, so what? Therefore, tell me more. Specialist terminology is really important. Don't just rely on common sense answers, yeah? The amount of responses I see sometimes that don't really actually use the material that's been taught on the course. And I know, it's tough to recall everything on the day under pressure. And if you've gone blank, you might as well write something, right? But just think about what key words you need to take into that exam, yeah? Even if that is a last minute, on the morning, cramming through some keywords, yeah? Having terminology will make a big difference. Okay, thanks very much, especially if you're still with me. Good luck with it all. Yeah, you got this. I hope this was useful. Please do revise everything. Good luck.